You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by Han Solo. That's right. Our favorite Wookiee's right-hand man is here to keep us hydrated. The good news, however, is that next week we've got one of our favorites, Jerome Horn, coming on the show to join us for Mondays, so I hope you'll tune in for that one. Also, I've been using this time at the start of the show to share future episodes of Talking Headways with you all, but also if you weren't able to listen to some of the previous episodes, definitely check out Alex Gouldworth and Alex Murphy last week talking about transport and security. That's a great one. Lots of great comments about that one. So check out if you missed it. This week, Stephanie Gideby and Helen Chin have a one-on-one conversation to talk about how to get more equitable outcomes out of the infrastructure bill. That one's going to be a fun one. Just listening to the two of them talk was really great, and hopefully you all enjoyed as well. Next week, Tom Wright of the Regional Plan Association joins us, and we've got a show lined up to talk about mega regions with Bob Yarrow, Fritz Steiner, and one of my professors at the University of Texas, Ming Zhang. So many exciting discussions coming soon. Jumping into next, because we cover many books, as I mentioned last time, we've partnered with bookshop.org as an affiliate. This means that if you buy a book through the Overhead Wire at Bookshop, a small amount of that purchase goes to us. Now, we love when you order from your local bookstores, but if you want to support the authors we have on and help keep us interviewing them, that would be tremendous. All the books we've discussed on the show with the authors are now in the shop, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. That's bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. This is episode 110. We are in session. Before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and subscribing means you get both Mondays at the Overhead Wire and Talking Headways on the same feed. 2 fun podcasts, 1 great channel. And thanks to folks who subscribe through podcatchers. It's awesome that you keep coming back to the show. We really do appreciate it. Okay, let's get to the news. So here are a few stories that piqued our interest from the newsletter over the last few weeks. This week, we're going to go a bit shorter and do just the news and perhaps a couple of extra comments instead of longer commentary, just to get some news in that we've missed over the last few weeks. So here's a couple of the news items that were popular at the Overhead Wire Daily. Merging cities for the climate. Small municipalities in Belgium are getting funding from the government to merge with other small municipalities in order to streamline administrative costs. Belgium is offering to take on the municipal debt of cities that merge, giving them more resources to deal with the climate change and other important issues. This was in the Mayor.eu. I think that this could happen, hopefully, in a lot of American cities, because ultimately there are so many jurisdictions and sometimes there are too many jurisdictions. It would be great if the federal government was able to give them some funding in order to focus on climate change and also consolidate so they didn't have 50 mayors in an area that maybe only needed 5. Next up, who rules transit? TransitCenter recently released their new report discussing who runs transit agencies and sits on boards around the United States and how they are not representative of the population they serve. In a sample of 108 board members in 11 cities, TransitCenter found that only 36 were people of color, compared to 58% of the population and 63% of transit riders. Geographically, suburban board members are overrepresented as well. This is from TransitCenter, obviously. So it's really good that they did this research, because I think that ultimately there's so many places that have under or wrongly represented areas that are making decisions for regions as a whole. So there's a lot of areas with suburban board members who don't ride the bus who are making decisions for bus riders, and it's really frustrating. And I think this report kind of pulls that out. And so it's something to pay attention to, especially if you're thinking about your MPO board, your local MPO board, your local transit agency board, those types of things. If you have elections for them, like we do here, say like for BART, it's not as big of a deal. But for a lot of agencies, a lot of the representation is just people who are, basically given the job of board member, or they're, they're nominated by a local elected official. And so something you all can do is think about, how your boards are constructed, and maybe there's something that can change in that structure that makes it more representative of the folks that ride transit or the folks that actually live in the region, in the MPO region. Interesting things to learn about. All right, Oslo's climate movement. Oslo has undertaken an ambitious climate budgeting process that city leaders hope will bring emissions down to 95% of 2009 levels by 2030. Because the city is smaller and operates more nimble than a national government, it's likely to achieve the goal without politics or rancor that usually accompanies these discussions. This was by Nick Romeo at The New Yorker. Lots of interesting things going on in Oslo. And I think another thing that's happening that's been really fascinating to learn what they're doing is they've been so successful at getting people into electric vehicles, and with some of the rebates and the ability to, say, like drive in HOV lanes and those types of things, they're now actually going to take back some of those perks that they gave electric vehicle drivers and give them to transit riders, and to make sure that people are using active transportation and not just driving everywhere, because they have so many EVs on the road. So there's a lot going on in Oslo that they're doing really great things to lower the the emissions that they cause. So I think that's really interesting, and doing it all by 2030. Especially getting down to those levels, that's going to be really a tough sell in a lot of countries. But I think places like Norway can do it. And it's interesting because they make a lot of their money off of oil and gas leases and sales. I'm interested to see how that works as well. All right, Los Angeles will be trying out its own universal basic mobility pilot, giving 2,000 residents in South LA $150 in a mobility wallet to use in any way they choose to get around. The mobility pilot is part of a larger sustainable transportation equity project, which also includes EV-related job training and charging infrastructure. So Oakland recently tried to do a universal basic mobility pilot as well, which I think we've discussed recently on the show. And LA is going to try one too. I'm interested to see if this actually picks up steam and happens all over the country, because kind of like that universal basic income discussion that we're having, there's a lot of discussion about universal basic mobility as well. And what's interesting about the discussion that we had earlier this week with Alex and Alex was in that transportation insecurity was, if we start to think about one of the things that they pointed out actually was that ultimately there are programs at the FDA, or actually I should say there are programs at HUD for housing, for example, where there's housing vouchers, those types of things. There's programs for like food stamps. There's programs that are focused on individuals mostly, but transportation from the federal level, they don't have an individual program. So it's interesting to see these local universal mobility pilots happening, and maybe that's something that the federal government can replicate or support locally. It's interesting to think about how that could be, basically transformed nationwide. Interesting to think about. Okay. New research out of England takes a look at regulatory gaps that allow American cars to get away with not having particulate filters that Chinese and European vehicles have. The result over the next 10 years without them is likely to result in 1.6 septillion more particles from U.S. vehicles. This was in Reuters. We talk about this all the time. The pollution that comes from automobiles isn't just from tailpipes. It's actually also from brake dust and from the particles that come from tires. And so there's a huge amount of issues with the filters for the tailpipes that exist before we go transition to electric cars. And 1.6 septillion more particles from U.S. vehicles than from other comparable vehicles that are gas engines is an amazing amount of pollution that we're letting out just because of a filter. And I think in the article they said that the filter was costing about $200 or so. So it's an extra cost, obviously, for the auto companies, but it's also something that's saving people their respiratory health. So I think that's probably pretty important. But it's something that that other countries are doing and we're not doing, and I think that's probably something that we can fix. Okay. After 9 hours of public comment, San Francisco supervisors voted 7-4 to make JFK Drive and Golden Gate Park free from cars. The fight over cars in the park has been building for decades, but the pandemic created urgency to make this section of road open to bikes and peds alone. This was in the San Francisco Examiner. One of the things that I think that has been really interesting is to watch this fight over JFK Drive. And I know that for me personally, I've sent the local museum I've sent them notes saying that I'm not going to patronize them until they stop complaining about car-free JFK. There's plenty of other places to park. They have they have a parking garage underneath the concourse in the center between them and the Academy of Sciences that they could use, that their workers could use if they're disabled, et cetera. And people can access that from Fulton on the other side of the park. And it's a tunnel that actually goes into the center of the park. So one street that's been, off to cars for this whole pandemic, that's been wonderful. I mean, it's a place that I like to go on a Saturday or Sunday if I get a chance. It's just amazing to start to see something like this happen. And a lot of the complaints, I felt like they were unfounded. So it's good to actually have this happen, actually have a vote to actually have it happen. And I know it'll probably get a bunch of lawsuits and stuff, but I'm pretty sure it can push back on those. But it's just the start of actually, thinking about active transportation in a different way in the city of San Francisco, making, priority for pedestrians and bikes on these streets is really important. And having a part of the park that's devoid of cars, while the rest of the park still has access to cars, is a really important step to giving people this really cool right-of-way in the city. Okay, next up. The U.S. Census Bureau will move 1,300 places from being classified as an urban area to a rural designation. The move has been discussed for months, and while many of these places operate more like rural places, they also received formula funding based on that status. This was in the Associated Press. So basically, the census redesignated places, under a certain, I think it was like 3,500 people. And basically what that means is that they're just kind of transformed into a different place according to the census designation, which means that if they're given formula funding through the federal government, it changes everything up. Now, I'm not exactly sure what this means for their funding, whether they lose funding, whether they gain funding from the more rural programs, but it's been frustrating, I think, for a lot of them because they haven't really gotten a clear answer from the feds about what this means exactly. So it's something that we should keep an eye on because it might actually mean less money for these places that actually probably need more resources. All right. Denmark will be the first country in the world to label food to show its climate change impact. The labels will show the carbon footprint of the food and are part of Denmark's climate action strategy. This is from the Food Policy Center. Really interesting. I think that some folks had thought about labeling gas station, basically the pumps at the gas station with this type of information. And Denmark is actually going to do it with food. So if you get a food, when you have the nutritional value, you're also going to get the climate impact as well, which is really interesting to think about. If you get packaging and it tells you the climate impact of that package and or what you get delivered, et cetera, that'd be really interesting to see what that actually looks like. And maybe it'll get people to think about maybe some of their choices. I know that I definitely probably would change some of my choices. Very interesting to learn about that in Denmark. And just a little distance away in Finland, an experimental study in Finland took a look at the impacts of green walls inside of office spaces. After just 1 month, workers found that skin health had improved and immune system regulation was enhanced. This was in Medical Express. I think a lot of the pandemic has taught us that we aren't really paying as much attention to indoor air quality as we might have before. And this is actually another indicator of that. Having a green wall inside of an office that actually changes your skin microbiome to a certain extent seems amazing and makes it more healthy. And I think that connection with nature is really important. But as I was saying before, with the pandemic, I think that there's a lot we can do about indoor air quality, especially when it comes to schools, public places, et cetera. And I don't think a lot of places are thinking about that right now. Obviously, it's going to be expensive for retrofits and things like that. But it's something that I think that, in order to make places safer and cleaner for people and maybe even reduce the amount of flu viruses and other things, respiratory viruses that are out there in the future, it might actually be the way forward. And, past, as I've mentioned this before, Jon Snow and the cholera pump in London, that was a big change in how they did things after he made the map that showed where the cholera was actually being acquired. And so things like the pandemic actually might change the way we do buildings, the way we do indoor air quality. And it's interesting to think about how this might change us going forward. Okay. Autonomous testing has been happening in cities for some time, but in Scotland, the UK will begin testing its first full-size city bus. The testing will take part on a 14-mile route and will have 2 staff members to guide passengers and make sure the testing is going according to plan. This is in the BBC. So we've had these little tiny shuttle type things that have been testing for autonomous buses But this is actually a full-size bus, a full-size city bus. And I think that there's a lot of other places that have probably been testing this, but this is the first one in the UK. Interesting enough, I think that buses are actually probably easier than autonomous vehicles more generally because they have a fixed route. It's probably the same route every day. And so they don't have as many things to learn necessarily as opposed to like a self-driving vehicle that would be going everywhere and anywhere in a city. And you have to account for so many things. It's interesting to think about how, buses that were self-driving could change how transit agencies operate and the operating costs and things like that. Obviously, there's something to be said about the workers that drive the buses, and there's going to be probably people on buses because you're not going to have empty buses going around without somebody kind of monitoring things. But it's interesting to think about something that could actually be a huge change coming up and maybe faster than the autonomous car, which people are talking about, could be the autonomous bus. We'll watch out for that. I got two more here. Norway has had amazing success getting people to adopt electric vehicles, perhaps too successful. To boost use of public transport, the country could rethink its electric car incentives, such as toll road and parking privileges and ability to drive in bus lanes. Not sure why they allowed bus lane driving in the first place, but this is cool. And I mentioned this earlier when I talked about Oslo's climate change policy. This is in Bloomberg. I just think it's really cool that they're starting to think about further away from just electric cars, but actually to active transportation. And finally, researchers at the University of Tokyo have found that density isn't the best predictor of the perception of congestion in a space, but rather the speed at which people are walking. People are basically frustrated by slow walkers. And this was in Science Daily. Really interesting. I get really frustrated at slow walkers, especially when it's in a really crowded place. And so you feel like it's crowded because you can't get around people because they're walking slow, or if they just won't move forward, or if they're blocking a whole part of a sidewalk and you just can't get past them, it feels crowded, but it's actually not. But that's the indicator about of whether people perceive there to be congestion or not, is whether people are walking slow. It's not the density of a place. It's not how many actual people are in a place, and it's not how many stores are in a place, et cetera. It's actually the slow walkers. Really interesting stuff out of the University of Tokyo. Okay. This week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without it, so thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during the pandemic, so we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month and you get some stickers and a handwritten note. $10 a month and you get your bus-only scarf. By the way, the bus-only scarf is officially sold out from the store, though there are still available for Patreon rewards, so I kept a few for that. If you want a bus-only scarf, you can do so by becoming a $10 a month supporter on Patreon. However, I just finished up the designs for a new lightweight bike scarf, and we'll have some more bus scarves in the near future. So I got a sample from the scarf company just this week, so we're getting close to getting back into the groove and getting folks the scarves that they desire. So hopefully that comes back soon, and we're looking forward to getting those back and giving them to the folks who want them. The bike-only scarf is a little bit more lightweight too. I've had some requests for lighter weight stuff from folks, so we're looking forward to that, and looking forward to letting people see what we've got planned. It's a really cool design, and I had folks actually last week or not last week, but last time we recorded. Ask about the design, and I sent them copies, and people were really excited. So I think folks are going to like the bus-only scarf and the bike-only scarf. Also, finally, I want to mention that we did produce an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning and Practice. And if you want to get your hands on one, go to raymondunwin.com. This book was super fun to produce, and if you're a history of planning fan, it's the very first one listed on the American Planning Association's 100 Essential Books of Planning. Check that out if you get a chance. And also, if you want to email us or send us a question, feel free to email us at theoverheadwire@gmail.com. I love getting your emails. And even if you all don't want to have them on the show and you just want a response, I'm more than happy to respond to emails. So send it over, theoverheadwire@gmail.com. I love getting emails from everybody, and I appreciate it. That means that you listened and you like the show enough to write in. So appreciate that. All right, Puppies and Butterflies. This is the part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe it just didn't fit in the other sections. And you know what? I've got a really fun Puppies and Butterflies this week. Let me find it here real quick. So there was an article in Minneapolis Magazine about shop pets. So shop pets of the Twin Cities. So minneapolismagazine.com. You don't need to own a dog or a cat to appreciate their impact on how we humans live with domesticated creatures. So kudos to some of our favorite haunts that are the workday homes to some great shop cats and dogs who greet you in their own special ways. So, when you go to a store and they have the local shop pets, it's really fun. We have an art store here in Noe Valley where there used to be a couple of corgis that hung out or actually a couple of shelties, I should say, not corgis, that hung out in the shop, and they were always around. And they didn't really like being around people necessarily. They'd kind of come and see who was coming in the store. But it was always fun to see them, even if they weren't coming up and rolling on your feet. But I love the idea of having shop pets. Probably not in food stores, obviously, but it's good to have them around. And it's funny because this article kind of lists all the places, the home goods stores, the dog shops, and the garden places where the dogs exist, the cats exist in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region. So really cool. I'll have that in the show notes, like all the other links to the articles. And folks should definitely check that out if they get a chance. So next week, Jerome Horn's going to be here. We're going to be really excited for that. Happy to have somebody come on the show and chat about the news from the previous week. As always, you can find me on Twitter at The Overhead Wire or at theoverheadwire.com. Thanks for joining us at Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous Patreons for sponsoring the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week.
Talk